the frozen forests of Belgium, a single American tank should have gone silent. When its engine refused to die, an entire German advance lost the night. By December 1944, the Ardennes forest was never supposed to be quiet. Snow muffled sound, fog erased distance, and every road was a potential trap. When the German offensive began, American units along the front were scattered, under strength, and often blind. Radios failed in the cold, roads clogged with refugees and wrecks. What held ground in those first hours was rarely firepower. It was, whatever happened, not to break. A German tank on the forest road near a small Belgian village was already at a disadvantage before the first shot was fired. It was thin-skinned, undergunned, and designed for mobility, not endurance. German doctrine assumed it would either withdraw or be destroyed quickly. Both outcomes depended on one thing: the engine. Inside the tank, the crew was already degrading. The radio operator had been killed by a near miss. The loader was bleeding and barely functional. The commander could no longer communicate with supporting units. That left only the driver, fully capable, a former farm mechanic who had learned long before the war that machines did not fail politely. They failed suddenly, and usually when they were needed most. The first German shell struck the hull without penetrating, but the impact cracked engine mounts and damaged cooling lines. The Sherman lurched, coughed, and stalled. In armored warfare, a stalled tank was worse than a destroyed one. It drew fire. It attracted infantry. It turned from protection into a trap. Doctrine said to abandon it. As German infantry began moving through the trees, he opened the internal access hatch and dropped into the engine compartment while the tank was still under fire. Steam, diesel fumes, and heat filled the space. The engine block was overheating rapidly, exactly as German planners expected it would in winter conditions under stress. No spare parts and no time, the driver did what he had done on farms years earlier. He improvised. He rerouted a damaged line with wire and cloth, packed snow around hot metal to slow overheating, and ignored the burns spreading across his hands and arms. Outside, the turret fired blindly into the tree line, buying seconds. And coughed again. The tank shuddered back to life, not as a weapon designed to advance, but as a machine that refused to disappear. And for the German units probing the forest road, that refusal was the first problem they had not planned for. The Sherman did not advance. It did not retreat. It simply stayed where it was, blocking the narrow forest road like a living obstruction. German infantry moved cautiously now, unsure whether the tank was fully operational or merely playing dead. That uncertainty was enough to slow them. In a few minutes, the engine threatened to stall again. The cold thickened oil, damaged mounts, vibrated loose. Each time the RPM dropped, the driver abandoned the controls and dropped back into the engine compartment, restarting, rerouting, forcing the machine to keep breathing. There was no rhythm to it, no schedule, only reaction. Shells continued to fall, walking closer. One struck a tree beside the road, showering the tank in splinters. Another burst near the rear deck, warping metal and worsening the leaks. The engine compartment filled with smoke so thick the driver had to work by touch. His fingers went numb, then burned, then numbed again. The tank's gun fired only when infantry got too close. Each shot was deliberate. Ammunition was limited. The tank was no longer fighting for ground. It was fighting for time. Commanders, observing from a distance, made a reasonable assumption. The roadblock was being held by multiple tanks rotating in and out. No single Sherman could survive this long otherwise. Reports filtered upward. The advance slowed. Units waited for engineers, for heavier armor, for confirmation. That arrived quickly. Minutes into hours. The Ardennes offensive depended on momentum. Every stalled road, every delayed column, forced rerouting through secondary paths that could not support heavy vehicles. Snow and mud swallowed half-tracks. Fuel consumption spiked. timetable slipped. Because one tank refused to die when it should have. By midnight, the Sherman's engine was failing faster than it could be repaired. Each restart lasted shorter than the last. The driver's hands were swollen, skin torn, blood mixing with oil. Breathing was shallow. The engine compartment was no longer safe, but safety had stopped being relevant hours earlier. Infantry finally attempted to close the distance under cover of darkness. Grenades bounced off the road and rolled toward the hull. The tank fired point blank into the tree line, muzzle flash lighting the snow like daylight. Bodies fell. The survivors pulled back again. Installed once more. The driver did not climb down immediately. He counted seconds. He waited for movement outside to pause. Then he dropped into the compartment and forced the starter again, flooding the engine, coaxing it back through sheer repetition. The Sherman lurched forward just enough to reposition, just enough to keep the road blocked. Movement mattered. Tank still active. Engineers hesitated. Infantry waited. Armor held back to avoid mines that were never there. The delay compounded itself, minute by minute, into hours lost across the sector. At dawn, American counterattacks began to form elsewhere along the line. The German timetable was already broken. What should have been a rapid penetration became a cautious, fragmented advance. Relief finally reached the forest road. They found the Sherman still in place. The engine was barely functional. The crew was barely conscious. The tank should have been abandoned half a night earlier. Instead, it had stayed. Done something no maneuver or order could have accomplished. It had denied the enemy momentum at the exact moment they needed it most. As the sky began to pale, the character of the fighting changed. German fire slackened, not because the threat was gone, but because the moment had passed. Units that should have been moving were now waiting for orders that came too late. The forest road, meant to be a conduit, had become a hesitation point. Inside the Sherman, the driver no longer thought in sequences or plans. His world had narrowed to sensations and tasks. Heat, vibration, the sound of the engine dropping a fraction too low. Each sign meant another intervention, another descent into the engine compartment, another gamble that the machine would answer. At some point before dawn, the engine refused to restart on the first attempt, then the second. The driver waited, counted breaths, and tried again. When it finally caught, it ran unevenly, knocking hard against damaged mounts. He left it that way. Smoothness no longer mattered. Presence did. Infantry probed once more, cautiously this time, firing into the hull from range. The Sherman answered with short, deliberate bursts from the turret gun, not enough to advance, just enough to remind them the tank was still alive. The reminder carried weight far beyond the forest road. Reports continued to flow upward, armor holding, resistance intact. Advance slowed. German commanders adjusted plans based on information that was technically accurate, but strategically misleading. The road was blocked. The tank was active. The delay was real. In the Sherman's position, American units were reorganizing. Stragglers were collected. Defensive lines thickened. What had begun as a chaotic retreat solidified into resistance. Time, bought one restart at a time, was turning into structure. Full daylight arrived. The forest revealed what the night had hidden. The Sherman was scarred, leaking, and blackened. The road was cratered. Trees were shredded, but the path was still denied. Only then did the driver finally let the engine die. When American infantry finally reached the forest road, they did not recognize what had happened at first. They saw a crippled Sherman sitting at an odd angle, engine silent, hull scarred by shrapnel and small arms fire. It looked abandoned. It looked finished. It looked like a failure that had simply not been cleared away yet. When they opened the hatches, did they understand? Exhausted beyond speech. The driver's hands were swollen, burned, and cut. stained with oil and blood. The engine compartment was a ruin of improvised fixes, fuel line held with wire, cloth burned stiff against metal, cooling reroutes that should never have worked. The tank had been kept alive not by design, but by refusal. Forces had already pulled back from the road. The opportunity window had closed. The delay had forced them onto secondary routes, broken their timing, and fractured coordination across the sector. What should have been a clean penetration became another stalled thrust in a campaign already slipping out of control. No report would ever list the Sherman as decisive. No map would mark the Forest Road as a turning point. There was no dramatic breakthrough, no countercharge launched from that position. The tank did not destroy an enemy column. It did not advance a single mile. It simply stayed. Something more damaging to the enemy than firepower could have done in that moment. It denied certainty. It introduced hesitation. It broke rhythm. Modern warfare, momentum is fragile. It exists only as long as movement continues uninterrupted. Once that movement stalls, even briefly, friction multiplies. Orders arrive late. Fuel is wasted. Units diverge. Confidence erodes. A pause at the wrong place spreads outward, infecting everything that follows. Sherman was that pause. Ended quietly. There was no clean story to tell, no single action to celebrate. Just hours of maintenance under fire, endurance without drama, function without relief. It did not fit the shape of heroism people expected. The lesson was clear to those who understood it. Destruction. Sometimes they are decided by non-failure, by the machine that does not stop when it should, by the person who substitutes for missing redundancy, by the refusal to disappear when disappearance is expected. Henderson Field, the outcome hinged on continuity, not brilliance, not innovation, just the sustained denial of collapse. The tank was eventually recovered and written off. The road reopened long after it no longer mattered. The driver survived the war and returned home to a life where broken machines could be turned off without consequence. For one night in the Ardennes, the logic of war had narrowed to a single truth. As long as something keeps working, the enemy cannot move. Have to change everything. Years later, no one would be able to point to the Forest Road on a map and explain why it mattered. No arrows drawn through it in post-war analyses. No dramatic before and after photographs. The Ardennes offensive would be explained through fuel shortages, Allied air power, strategic overreach. The stalled advance near the village would dissolve into statistics. That is how modern war actually ends, not with singular moments of clarity, but with accumulated friction that no one can fully trace back to its source. The delay caused by the Sherman never appeared as a failure in German records. It appeared as a series of small adjustments, rerouted columns, delayed engineers, altered attack times. Each change looked reasonable in isolation. Together, they unraveled momentum. This is how systems collapse. Right, but because they are forced to operate off balance for too long. Never thought in those terms. He did not imagine himself shaping an offensive or altering history. His world that night had been reduced to an engine that kept failing, and an understanding that if it failed completely, everything behind him would fail too. Narrow focus was not ignorance, it was accuracy. War does not reward people who see the whole picture. It rewards people who solve the immediate problem without waiting for permission, relief, or certainty. Strategy emerges afterward, reconstructed by people who were not there. The driver returned home after the war. He did not speak about the tank. There was no language for what he had done. He had not fought an enemy so much as argued with a machine for hours, refusing to accept its decision to stop. That is not a story that fits comfortably into memory. Machines, unlike people, do not care about meaning. They respond only to pressure, tolerance, and force. That night, the driver matched the machine's indifference with his own. He did not ask whether it was reasonable to continue. He asked only whether it was possible. As long as it was possible, he continued. Many so-called turning points in war. Victory often belongs to whoever remains functional after logic says they should have failed, not because they are better, but because they are still present. Sherman did not win a battle. It did not destroy an enemy unit. It did not advance the line. It prevented absence. Absence is contagious. Once a position disappears, others follow. Once a road opens, movement accelerates. Once silence appears, confidence shifts. That chain never began on the forest road because something broken stayed in place long enough to deny it. It is the lesson that links this night to Henderson Field and countless others like it. Wars are not always decided by those who strike hardest. They refuse to disappear when the system expects them to. Heroes in the traditional sense, not innovators, not symbols, just people who keep something alive past the point where it should reasonably stop. And for a few critical hours, that is enough. The longer one studies wars at scale, the clearer it becomes that decisive moments rarely announce themselves. They do not arrive with banners or certainty. They arrive disguised as endurance problems, maintenance problems, timing problems, mundane issues that only become visible when they are not solved. The night on that forest road fits that pattern perfectly. Strategic perspective. The Ardennes offensive failed because it demanded perfection from systems that could not sustain it. Fuel consumption exceeded projections. Roads collapsed under traffic they were never meant to carry. Weather delayed air support. Command assumed speed would compensate for fragility. It did not. Speed without resilience creates only faster failure. Mobilized Sherman exposed that fragility in a way no direct confrontation could. German units expected resistance to be destroyed or bypassed. They were prepared for combat. They were not prepared for persistence. A tank that should have been gone was still there, not advancing, not retreating, just occupying space and time. It matters because warfare is governed as much by expectation as by force. Commanders plan based on what they believe will happen. When reality diverges even slightly, decision-making slows. Confirmation is sought. Orders are delayed. Subordinates hesitate. The system burns time, trying to understand why something is not behaving as predicted. Sherman created exactly that divergence. German reports were technically accurate. There was armor on the road. It was active. It fired occasionally. None of that was false. What was missing was context. There was no rotation, no relief, no support. Just a single machine being kept alive beyond reasonable limits. That distinction was invisible from a distance, but it mattered enormously. Highlights an uncomfortable truth. Asterisk, asterisk, war rewards opacity, asterisk, asterisk. Not deception in the classic sense, but situations where the enemy cannot easily determine how fragile or resilient a position actually is. The Sherman appeared stronger than it was simply by remaining present. The cost of probing that assumption was too high, so German units chose caution. Caution cost momentum. Momentum, once lost, is extraordinarily difficult to regain. Offensive operations depend on rhythm. Timetables synchronize fuel, ammunition, engineers, artillery, and follow-on units. When one element pauses unexpectedly, everything behind it begins to stack up. Vehicles idle. Fuel is consumed without progress. Cold sets in. Morale erodes. Small inefficiencies compound into systemic drag. Drag rarely shows up in after-action reports as a single cause. Instead, it appears as a general loss of tempo, blamed on weather, terrain, or logistics. The true origin is often a series of small refusals to collapse. He did not know any of this. He did not need to. His role was not to understand the system, but to become a substitute for its missing resilience. When the engine mounts cracked, he became the mount. When cooling failed, he became the cooling system. When redundancy disappeared, he became redundancy. Where modern war reveals its most exploitative dynamic. It treats human adaptability as an unlimited resource. Machines are allowed to fail within parameters. Humans are expected to compensate without parameters at all. It reinforces this expectation. Soldiers are taught to improvise, adapt, overcome. What is rarely acknowledged is that this adaptability comes at a cost that cannot be fully repaid. Each time a human compensates for systemic failure, the system learns the wrong lesson that it can afford to fail again. Malone's machine guns at Henderson Field taught the same lesson. They kept firing past design limits because a human absorbed the excess stress. The system survived, but the human paid. The Sherman repeated that pattern. The tank remained present because someone accepted consequences the machine was not designed to bear. From an engineering perspective, this is perverse. Systems should be built to fail safely, not to offload failure onto operators. War, however, rarely allows for such elegance. When survival is at stake, safety margins become negotiable. Humans become shock absorbers. This is why stories like this are uncomfortable. They reveal that victory often depends not on superior design, but on willingness to consume people quietly. After the war, analysts would praise American logistical superiority, industrial output, and flexibility. All of that is true, but it coexisted with moments where individual survival depended on ignoring everything engineers and doctors would recommend. The macro-level strength masked micro-level brutality. Ivor's silence after the war is telling. There was nothing to explain. He had not made a choice in the moral sense. He had responded to necessity. Explaining that to people who never experienced that necessity would only create misunderstanding. Better to let the story collapse into vagueness. Silence is common among those who served as failure buffers. Their actions are hard to translate into narratives of valor because they lack clear arcs. There is no charge, no victory moment, no visible triumph, just sustained resistance to entropy. Entropy is the real enemy in modern war. Enemy forces apply pressure, but entropy does the killing. Heat, friction, fatigue, confusion, miscommunication, these degrade systems relentlessly. Combat accelerates degradation. Victory belongs to the side that slows entropy long enough for the other side to succumb first. Sherman slowed entropy locally. That local effect propagated outward, influencing decisions far removed from the forest road. This is why small actions can have disproportionate impact without ever being recognized as such. It also explains why many veterans struggle with post-war narratives. They lived in a world governed by entropy management, then returned to a world that pretends outcomes are clean and intentional. The dissonance is profound. Societies want heroes because heroes simplify causality. A hero implies intention, control, and moral clarity. Endurance under failure implies none of those things. It implies chaos, temporarily resisted, not mastered. Sherman's story resists heroification because it lacks spectacle. No enemy column destroyed, no dramatic last stand, just refusal to leave. Yet strategically, it was more disruptive than many spectacular engagements. It denied the enemy certainty at a critical moment. It suggests a broader lesson for understanding war. Absence and presence matter more than action and destruction. What is not there can be more decisive than what is destroyed. A missing roadblock opens possibilities. A present obstacle closes them. The tank did not advance Allied objectives directly. It did not push the line forward. It prevented the enemy from pushing theirs. That distinction matters because defense often shapes outcomes more decisively than offense. Offensive actions are visible. Defensive endurance is invisible until it fails. Invisibility leads to chronic underestimation of defensive resilience in planning. Commanders assume obstacles will collapse on schedule. When they do not, the entire plan becomes brittle. The Ardennes offensive was full of such assumptions. Forest Road was one of many points where reality refused to conform. Most of those refusals were minor. Together, they were decisive. Never became one such refusal. A modern war cannot be understood solely through battles and campaigns. It must be understood through points of non-failure, moments where collapse was expected but delayed. These moments rarely appear in history books because they lack narrative clarity, but they are everywhere. Every war contains hundreds of Shermans that should have stopped but did not. Hundreds of machine guns that should have overheated but kept firing. Hundreds of radios that should have gone silent but were kept alive with improvised wiring. Most of them are anonymous. Anonymity is not accidental. It reflects discomfort. Acknowledging these moments means acknowledging that victory often depends on pushing people beyond recoverable limits. That is not a comforting truth for societies that want to believe wars are fought cleanly. Ardennes offensive ultimately failed for many reasons, but its failure was accelerated by countless small disruptions like the one on that forest road. Each disruption stole minutes. Minutes stole hours. Hours stole momentum. Momentum stole the offensive. From that perspective, the Sherman did not merely block a road, it blocked a future that German planners assumed was inevitable. The future required everything to work. Not. And that is often enough. The most honest way to understand such moments is not through celebration, but through recognition. Recognition that war is sustained by people who accept being used as temporary replacements for failing systems. Recognition that these people are not heroes in the mythic sense, but load-bearing elements. Move them, and collapse accelerates. Comes change. Not glory. And mechanics, in war, decide far more than ideals ever will. If there is a final, uncomfortable clarity that emerges from studying moments like this, it is that war does not reward virtue, intelligence, or even strength in the way people imagine. It rewards tolerance for degradation, whoever can endure breakdown of machines, of plans, of bodies slightly longer than the other side gains leverage that compounds rapidly. This is why war is so often misunderstood by those who view it only through outcomes. They see who advanced, who retreated, who won. They do not see how close everything came to failing before those outcomes emerged. They do not see how many times victory depended on something not breaking when all evidence suggested it should. Sherman on the Forest Road existed in that narrow margin. It was not decisive by design. It was decisive because it violated expectation, and expectation in war governs behavior as much as force does. German units expected resistance to degrade in a predictable sequence: engagement, damage, withdrawal, or destruction. When that sequence stalled, commanders did what humans always do under uncertainty. They slowed down. They sought confirmation. They waited. Each of those responses was rational. Together, they were fatal to momentum. Momentum is not just speed. It is confidence in the future. It is the belief that the next mile will resemble the last. Once that belief is shaken, every decision becomes heavier. Risks feel larger. Caution replaces aggression. Time begins to leak away. Why the most effective defensive actions in war are often not violent, but persistent They create doubt rather than destruction. They force the enemy to question assumptions instead of reacting automatically. Doubt is corrosive. It spreads faster than fear. Germans spread doubt simply by remaining. Stated plainly, visibility matters more than capability. The tank did not need to be fully operational. It needed to be seen as potentially operational. The difference is crucial. War is fought with incomplete information. Commanders act on probabilities, not certainties. When probabilities shift toward risk, behavior changes. Firing occasionally, by moving just enough to reposition, by refusing to go silent, the tank maintained an illusion of resilience that exceeded its reality. That illusion forced the enemy to respect it disproportionately. The cost of testing that illusion was too high under time pressure. Dynamic appears repeatedly in modern conflict. A radar that might still work delays airstrikes. A missile battery that might still have ammunition forces detours. A unit that might still resist ties down forces far larger than itself. The actual strength of the system matters less than the uncertainty surrounding its collapse. Humans are the most effective creators of that uncertainty because they can improvise beyond design limits. Machines cannot pretend to function. Humans can. Improvisation extracts payment. It consumed physical health, psychological resilience, and long-term stability. These costs are rarely calculated in strategic assessments. They are externalized. War counts tanks, fuel, and time. It does not count nervous systems. This creates a moral asymmetry. States benefit from human adaptability while disclaiming responsibility for its consequences. They praise improvisation in combat, then struggle to support those who lived that improvisation afterward. The same flexibility that made someone valuable in war becomes problematic in peace. It is not a failure of character. It is a failure of context. In civilian life, problems are rarely binary. Effort does not always produce immediate results. Persistence can be counterproductive. Pain is a warning, not an obstacle. The habits forged under fire clash with these realities. People optimized for crisis often find stability disorienting. Disorientation is invisible in victory narratives. Societies prefer closure. They want wars to end cleanly, with lessons neatly summarized and costs fully paid. But the real costs trail behind, unresolved, carried by individuals who were forced to bridge gaps systems could not. German driver was one such individual. His story did not require recognition to matter. It mattered because it revealed how thin the line between success and failure truly was. Ardennes offensive is remembered as a gamble that failed. What is less remembered is how many times that gamble depended on everything working perfectly. War plans are often optimistic not because planners are foolish, but because pessimism is paralyzing. To act at all, one must assume enough will work. Reality is less cooperative. People get lost, orders arrive late, small disruptions accumulate. When enough of them occur, the plan collapses. The forest road was one of those disruptions. Not spectacular, not dramatic, but stubborn. Stubbornness is the hidden currency of war. It does not win battles directly. It changes probabilities. It alters pacing. It creates windows for other forces to act. By the time outcomes become visible, the original cause is buried under layers of consequence. Historians often search for decisive moments because they provide narrative clarity. But war is more accurately shaped by decisive delays, moments where something did not happen on time. The German advance did not reach its objective when planned. Airfields did not fall when expected. Bridges did not open when needed. Each delay cascaded. German contributed to that cascade. Frames how we should think about military effectiveness. It is not about maximizing destruction. It is about maximizing friction for the enemy while minimizing collapse in oneself. Destruction can be repaired. Friction compounds. Also explains why modern militaries emphasize resilience, redundancy, and sustainment more than raw performance. Peak capability matters less than how long capability can be maintained under stress. A system that performs at 80% for twice as long is more valuable than one that performs at 100% briefly. German performed at far less than 80%, but it performed long enough, and that is often the threshold that matters. The Forest Road story is not about a tank or a driver. It is about a principle that recurs across conflicts and eras. Victory often belongs to whoever can deny collapse longer, not whoever can impose destruction faster. Principle is uncomfortable because it strips war of romance. It replaces bold charges with clogged roads. It replaces heroic duels with maintenance under fire. It replaces moral certainty with mechanical persistence. It is more honest. Forest Road and countless unnamed moments like them all point to the same truth. War is not won by extraordinary acts alone. It is won by ordinary actions repeated under extraordinary pressure until something else gives way first. Sometimes that something else is an engine. Sometimes it is a plan. It is a human being. The outcome depends on which fails last. Stories we tell. There is a temptation, when confronted with stories like this, to search for moral resolution, to ask whether the suffering was worth it, whether the outcome justified the cost, whether history balances the ledger in some invisible way. War encourages those questions because they offer comfort. Unfortunately, the system that produces outcomes like the Forest Road does not operate on moral accounting. It operates on exhaustion. Accelerated wear. Every component, human or mechanical, is subjected to stress until something gives. The side that wins is not the side that avoids wear, but the side that distributes it more effectively. Machines absorb some of it. Logistics absorbs some of it. And when neither is sufficient, people absorb the rest. The German driver was not exceptional because he chose to absorb that stress. He was exceptional because circumstances left no other place for it to go. Distinction matters because it reframes responsibility. We often praise individuals for stepping up, but rarely interrogate why stepping up was necessary in the first place. In war, stepping up is not a virtue, it is a failure signal, It indicates that redundancy is gone, margins are gone, and the system is running on borrowed time. Henderson Field, Basilone stepped up because machine gun crews were dead, ammunition was running out, and doctrine no longer applied. On the Forest Road, the driver stepped up because the tank's engine failed and no recovery was possible. In both cases, the individual became a temporary patch for systemic breakdown. This is the point where popular narratives diverge sharply from reality. Stories emphasize willpower, grit, and determination. Reality emphasizes constraint, The people who endure these moments do not choose heroism. They choose between two forms of loss and take the one that preserves the system, even if it destroys them later. Later destruction is harder to see, which makes it easier to ignore. When wars end, societies rush to closure. They want demobilization, reintegration, and normalcy. They want to believe that the extraordinary behaviors demanded by war can be neatly folded back into ordinary life. This belief is not supported by evidence. Optimize for survival under extreme pressure, often struggle in environments where pressure is diffuse, ambiguous, and slow. The clarity of crisis disappears. The feedback loop breaks. Actions no longer produce immediate, tangible results. The skills that once mattered most, endurance, suppression of pain, relentless focus, lose their usefulness. Remains is a nervous system calibrated for emergencies that no longer arrive. This is why many veterans describe peace as strangely empty or overwhelming. Not because they miss violence, but because they miss coherence, War reduces the world to solvable problems with direct consequences. Peace expands it into uncertainties with delayed outcomes. The transition is not relief, it is destabilization. The German driver returned to a world where engines could be turned off without consequence, where machines could be left broken overnight, where failure did not mean immediate death. These conditions are healthier, but they are alien to someone whose survival depended on ignoring every instinct to stop. The difficulty is that societies benefit from this kind of adaptation while pretending it leaves no residue. They build myths of resilience that celebrate endurance but avoid discussing recovery. They honor the act without acknowledging the aftermath. This creates a cycle. Each war produces a generation of people who learned how to hold collapsing systems together with themselves. Each piece struggles to absorb them. The lesson learned by institutions is not restraint, but reliance. If necessary, someone will step up again. Reliance is dangerous. Plans that assume extraordinary human performance as a baseline rather than an exception. It normalizes the idea that individuals will compensate for systemic fragility. It treats adaptability as an infinite resource. Not to how many times a person can replace a missing part before they themselves fail. That failure may not occur on the battlefield. It may occur years later, quietly, in ways that do not appear in casualty lists. The German story, like Henderson Field, sits at the intersection of success and cost. The outcome was favorable. The price was deferred. Understanding this does not diminish the accomplishment. It deepens it. It forces recognition that what was achieved required more than courage. It required a willingness to accept damage without immediate repair. This is why war stories that focus only on triumph feel incomplete. They show the system's output without showing its internal wear. They celebrate the moment the machine keeps running without showing what was burned to make that possible. The first road was cleared eventually. The tank was recovered or scrapped. The offensive failed. History moved on. The pattern remained. There have been moments where something broken stayed in place long enough to matter. A unit that held without orders. A pilot who flew past safe limits. A medic who worked past collapse. A technician who kept a system alive with improvised fixes. Most of these moments never make it into books. Not dramatic enough. Comes more reliably than grand gestures. There's a final lesson worth carrying forward. It is not about emulation but awareness. Awareness that war extracts its victories through attrition of people as much as equipment. Awareness that resilience has a human cost that does not disappear when the fighting ends. Awareness that every time a system relies on someone to absorb failure, it is spending something precious and finite. The German driver did what was necessary. Barcelona did what was necessary. The system survived. But necessity is not justification. It is the first step toward understanding war, not as a stage for heroism, but as a process that consumes adaptability until nothing remains to adapt. Perhaps, if that understanding is taken seriously, it can inform choices before the next forest road, the next airfield, the next night when something should have stopped but didn't, and that recognition leads to a final, more unsettling implication, one that extends beyond any single battle or war. Victory so often depends on people absorbing failure when systems break. Then the true measure of a military is not how well it fights, but how often it forces individuals to become expendable buffers. This is not a judgment about courage or honor. It is a structural observation. The more a system relies on